Okay, I'll start now. I'd like to welcome everybody on this call to today's event, Real Security, Not Tory Military Spending Spree, hosted by Labour CND and by Arise. I'm Richard Bergen, Member of Parliament for Leeds East, and I'm proud to be chairing today's event. I'm joined by a platform of excellent speakers this afternoon. My friend, long-standing peace activist and Labour member, Jeremy Corbyn MP, Professor Paul Rogers, who's a real authority and someone we should always listen to, London CND's Emma Dent Code, a fantastic and courageous campaigner, someone we miss so very much in Parliament, and Labour National Executive Committee member Nadia Jama. So the concept of welfare, not warfare, is incredibly important because this meeting does come at a crucial time. Last week, the government announced £16 billion, that's 16,000 million pounds in additional military funding. That's the highest increase in 30 years, a huge increase on top of what is already Europe's largest military budget. And the government did this at the same time as announcing pay freezes for public sector workers, benefit increases of just 37 pence, and public sector cuts. There's always money for war, but never for our essential public services. So we need to be organising together the largest campaign possible against the increase and for investment in the welfare of the people, not in warfare. This investment isn't just a reflection of the wrong priorities, but the wrong understanding of security in the 21st century. Our approach to global security should be focused on the real threats we face, the threats of climate change and global public health risks. The COVID crisis that exposed huge underinvestment in our National Health Service and social care and much else. And the government's £16 billion increase on the military was more than it had announced a day before in its funding to fight climate change. So we need to be making the case for the government to invest in the real threats our people face. This huge new funding isn't just a grotesque example of how our state treats its people. It's a sign of the geopolitical reorientation of the UK that we are likely to see more of as the UK tries to get even closer to the USA in a post-Brexit world. The government will soon undertake a new strategic defence and security review. In its own words, this will define the UK's role in the world and the long-term strategic aims for our national security and foreign policy. That's likely to mean a big push to move the UK ever closer to the US and its military priorities. So we need to make our voices heard now. We need to push for a different approach, supporting multilateralism and supporting cooperation. This push for greater military investment and the defence review also comes at a time of worrying signs of a new Cold War opening up between the US and China. Some call it a new Cold War. Such a Cold War risks vast resources being reallocated from public services to rising military budgets. A world divided into various camps risks undermining the economic, climate and public health cooperation the world needs now more than ever. And it also poses a threat to peace. We know, don't we, that Cold Wars can become hot wars and proxy wars. So we need to be opposed to any US-led new Cold War. And we need to be building pressure for an end to nukes. Next year will be the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. We must take that opportunity and make it an opportunity for Britain to step up to its international commitments for disarmament. A year ago, standing in for Jeremy at the ITV leaders debate in the run-up to the general election, I made it clear on TV that we should be scrapping nukes and investing instead in industries that create jobs and support the public good. Sadly, the government is building 4 new submarines, the Dreadnought class, to replace Trident. This will cost at least £200 billion and keep Britain a nuclear-armed state for decades to come. Nuclear weapons don't keep us safe. They're not the answer to the country's security. They're useless in dealing with terrorism and useless in dealing with cyber warfare. It's time for a new vision of society and security, and nuclear weapons have no part in it. There are other big topics we may touch on today, including peace in the Middle East, the Yemen, and ongoing support for Saudi Arabia, and the need to push for the Palestinian people to get justice. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is Paul Rogers. And Paul, as many of you will know, is an international security specialist of many years standing. He's the Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, just up the road from where I am now, a Senior Fellow of the Oxford Research Group, and Open Democracy's International Security Advisor. Paul's the author of several books, including Losing Control, Global Security in the 21st Century, and he's a regular broadcaster on radio and TV networks worldwide. So I'm delighted to introduce Paul Rogers. If you could unmute yourself, please, Paul. We need to hear your comments. Not to be accused of silencing you.
Sorry, I thought I was still unmuted centrally. Sorry about that. Look, it's a real privilege to be joining the panel with Nadia, Emma, and Jeremy. And what I want to try and do is to just go through fairly quickly how we should be thinking about a proper security policy, because I think what we have now is something which is really way out from what we should have. Look at it this way. I think the way a country like Britain, medium-sized power, thinks about security typically is it's really a military industrial complex. Eisenhower popularized that word incredibly. It tends to privilege national security, and it's defined by a defense establishment. It tends to have a short-term outlook and extends control by means of the military. It basically concentrates on military control. I call it lidism. You keep the lid on things rather than actually looking at the underlying reasons why you have conflicts. But we're very much set in our ways on that. I think as far as Britain is concerned, it's also because we simply can't come to terms with our own history. You saw it very clearly with Johnson going on about aircraft carriers and sort of traveling the world and the rest, and really expressing ourselves as a great power. I think we and the French have what has been called a delusion of post-imperial grandeur. And it's rooted also in the nature of this complex, the way that people think normally about defense. It's a narrative which is dominated by a relatively small group of people, some civil servants, a lot of arms companies, academics, and the rest. And it has a disproportionate business influence because obviously military matters are very, very profitable, and they're appreciated as such. And over the last 30, 40 years, most of the big defense companies or military companies have actually consolidated into very few, and they have very, very powerful lobbies. There's a kind of institutional inertia to all of this. Nothing really is going to change because it is always very inward looking. And having lectured at defense colleges and done a lot of teaching on the military side, I have to say the whole thing is imbued with a kind of hegemonic masculinity. That's the kind of culture within it. And in many ways, it's abstracted from the real life impacts. So you put that all together and you've got something which is going to be very hard to crack, but in a sense, we've got to really try and get people to rethink what we mean by security. I think there's some very good groups who are now trying to do it. The rethinkingsecurity.org in particular is a good one. And I think if you look at what they're saying, they recognize the kind of problem we face. On the other hand, there's a huge amount that could be done. And I think there's a very strong case for saying, in fact, Britain could play a much more significant role in trying to move us towards a more peaceful world overall, I suppose. A number of different things which be obvious if you rethink what we mean. Obviously, the focus has to be on the individuals and the communities and their needs. We're much more concerned about the idea that security means basically freedom from fear and want. And it's a common right. It's a right for everybody. It's not something which comes straight away. You require patient practice and you have to have it long term and you have to share your responsibility. But the idea is just to see it in a completely different way from the sort of that military industrial complex, which might be anywhere away from where you are, and really very much bound with a degree of secrecy. Now, if we were to move away from this, what kinds of things could we see in practice? What are the kinds of things that a country like Britain could do? Well, obviously, we have absolutely no need in any sense, if we ever did, I don't think we ever did, for nuclear weapons. But to put it bluntly, you can't nuke a virus and you can't deter climate breakdown. It just doesn't work. It's irrelevant. In many ways, much of our defense policy, or say military policy, I shouldn't even use the term defense, much of our military policy is actually obsolete. That doesn't mean I'm not a pacifist myself, although I get closer to that the older I get. But the point is, it doesn't mean that you don't have any kind of defenses, but they've got to be appropriate. One idea which I quite like, which I know it actually originated with a group of Quakers in Headton Bridge, is the idea that you actually cut military spending by an agreed 5% a year for the next 10 years. Now that's reverse compound interest, so you're talking about a cut down to about 40% of the present. Now getting rid of Trident, of course, will help with that, but a lot of other stuff has to go as well. But what are the positive things you could do? Well, obviously, a country like Britain, which whatever happens in the future, has connections with the United States, it has connections with Europe, it has a lot of connections still with the Commonwealth. It can actually play a much more powerful role in what you might call catalyzing a different response worldwide. Obviously, more support for the United Nations, obviously far more support for action on climate breakdown and preventing it, and of course, as we now know, on global pandemics as well. I'd like to see Britain playing a much more important role in conflict resolution, in peace building, in peacekeeping, and of course, in UN peace measures. A whole range of things where you could be a much bigger player, not with great expenditure, but with using people who are skilled in these things. We should certainly have a much higher effort on the whole arms control side, both conventional and of course nuclear, chemical and biological. And if we're getting rid of nuclear weapons, then we could be a model of how it's done. And that would be hugely valuable for many other countries. Obviously, I think we have to much increase our international development spending, increase the quality of it, so it's not just building new markets, and focus, I would say, on inequality, gender issues, and sustainability in approaching climate breakdown and preventing it. You put that together with a big increase in national research on global health issues and also on climate breakdown issues, and basically you have the beginnings of a state which is playing a quite different role to that in the past. But it's actually about real security. It's not about this sort of artificial view of security, which is so deeply embedded. I'm not remotely pretending that this is quick or easy, but I think the key thing is if we have this kind of vision in our own minds of where we would like to be, let us say in 10 years' time, then now is the time to really work on them and just say to people, yes, there is an alternative. We have to think about security completely different. If we do that, the curious thing is that you're redefining the great in Great Britain. You're saying countries should have different kinds of priorities. So really, that's all I wanted to say just for starters. There are huge opportunities over the next decade to do this. And really, it's going to have to be people like us who push it forward. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was fantastic and very insightful. And there will be opportunities at the end to ask Paul and the other panelists questions. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, an inspirational politician, an inspirational internationalist, inspirational peace campaigner and anti-racist, the person who we wanted to see as Prime Minister now. I'm referring, of course, to Jeremy Corbyn, the Member of Parliament for Islington North. We've got this situation where Jeremy is quite rightly a Labour Party member, where Jeremy is quite rightly a Member of Parliament, but he isn't officially a Labour Member of Parliament. So he's a Labour member and a Member of Parliament, but not a Labour Member of Parliament. Jeremy should have the whip back and should be a Labour Member of Parliament again. But I'm delighted to introduce him. Of course, he is the Vice President of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And Jeremy's also a former chair of Stop the War Coalition. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jeremy.
Richard, thank you very much. And thank you very much for what you just said. And if I could open just by saying a huge thank you to the many, many people all over the country who have sent in messages and letters of support in my situation, and have put themselves at considerable political risk by raising the issue of my suspension and that of others from the Labour Party at their local Labour Party meetings. I'm very grateful for all that support, and it really is a political issue about our right to be able to speak and our right to be able to change policy or develop policy within our party. And so thank you very, very much for all your support on this, and also, of course, for being on this call today. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, Paul, who's been such a fantastic friend for so many years, so knowledgeable and such an anchor whenever one is discussing or thinking about long-term foreign policy and strategy issues. And of course, we're going to hear later from my great friend Emma, we're going to hear from Nadia, and I want also to put on record my thanks to Carol and Labour CND for everything that they do, because being active in CND as I have been, I first joined CND when I was 15, and I've not left it and no intention of leaving it, because I want to see a world of peace. Paul said some very profound things when he was talking about the sort of macho posturing that leads to an awful lot of so-called defence thinking. And indeed, I've never forgotten going to speak to the Naval College in Greenwich once about nuclear disarmament. And it was quite interesting, because once they'd got over the shock of an MP coming along who wanted to spend less on defence and more on welfare, they then got into quite serious debate about the value or otherwise of nuclear weapons, and decided, many of them, that it was actually damaging to the interests of the security aspects of the Navy by spending so much on nuclear weapons disproportionately to anything else. And so they got into quite an interesting discussion about nuclear disarmament. And I'm sure that Paul, in all the lectures and talks he's given, has probably had many of the same kinds of conversations with people over the years. But what I want to just draw your attention to, everyone, is the way in which defence issues are debated in Britain, the way in which the media always talk about defence issues. And as I know from having done about 80 to 100 hustings events in 2 leadership contests and a large number of debates and Q&As in 2 general election campaigns, the issue of defence always starts from the posture of how strong you're going to be in attacking somebody else. And it's always put in a very sort of macho posturing. It's never saying, Mr. Corbyn, what do you think are the major security issues in the world? It's nearly always put instead, by how much more will you spend on weapons? Do you support the use of nuclear weapons, and would you use them? And then goes on to talk about the need for Britain to have global reach. And our media reflect all this in their discussions and their debates. I always say to them, well, okay, just if you've got a few moments, look through at least the summary of the Chilcot report of how that kind of thought process led us into the war in Iraq, which has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million people, and the numbers of people that are now suffering as refugees and displaced people still as a result of that war. Just think the whole process through. And I think we also need to look at what is now happening with the British Tory government. In the midst of huge spending issues, and they are huge spending issues surrounding the corona crisis, the government announces a substantial increase in expenditure on armaments, and at the same time announces a cut in the overseas aid budget, as well as closing down the Department for International Development and putting it under the Foreign Office, thus making it an arm of foreign policy rather than an act of solidarity with the poorest people around the world. And then, at the same time, goes on to wage freeze many people in the public sector, to underfund local authorities, and as Richard has correctly pointed out in his introduction, virtually freeze welfare benefits at the same time. And so we know where the Tories are coming from. And so before we go into the discussion, I ask you just to think about what are the causes of insecurity around the world. We're a world of people in all parts of the world, obviously, rich, poor, and of living in different places. A lot of people in the world, about a fifth, face food insecurity. A smaller number, but a significant number, face hunger at all times. Yet there is food overproduction and food waste around the world. Food insecurity leads to famine, hunger, leads to all kinds of other problems. And then the corona crisis has demonstrated just how bad the health insecurity and health inequality is around the world. We in Britain, fortunately, have a National Health Service, underfunded and stressed in many ways, but it is a principle of healthcare free at the point of need, which is so important. The World Health Organization would like that for the rest of the world, but are not going to get it. And so these problems and the economic inequalities lead to refugee flows. And the biggest problem facing the world, in addition to that, is the environmental disaster and crisis of global warming and loss of habitat, loss of open space, and the health problems that go with that. So what do we need? An industrial strategy that is green, a green industrial revolution. What do we need? A human rights-based foreign policy that stands up to regimes that abuse human rights, such as Saudi Arabia, and doesn't sell them arms. But instead, we have a government that's doing the very opposite. So in the few seconds I've got left, I'd just like to leave you with this thought. Our party was founded by brave people with vision. Keir Hardie's vision of a world of peace, of justice, of human rights and democracy. We exist for that purpose. So let's make sure in all the debates that go on over the next few months, let's recalibrate, as we started to do over the last 5 years, foreign policy into something that's based on peace, on justice, on human rights and democracy, and go to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference for the first time ever as a declared nuclear weapons state to say we will fulfill our obligations under the NPT and take steps, real steps, towards nuclear disarmament and encourage others to do the same and support the UN call for a global ban on nuclear weapons. That would be the best message ever to come out of what has been a disaster for millions, known as the corona crisis. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for coming along to this discussion this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And that was absolutely wonderful. The next speaker I'm delighted to introduce is Nadia Jammer, and she's from Sheffield. I first came across her during various trade union and Labour campaigns in South Yorkshire. Nadia is the daughter of a Somali steelworker. She grew up under Thatcher's government on a council estate near Orgreave, and I'm sure that so many of you were absolutely delighted when just the other week Nadia was elected to Labour's National Executive Committee, where she's put into practice already her promise to speak up for members, defend members, and defend the socialist policies of the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, policies which, of course, are more relevant now than ever in the context of the economic crisis and the public health crisis, and policies which need deepening. Nadia's unfortunately got to leave us after her speech for another meeting, but we're looking forward to hearing from her about the whole issue of nuclear disarmament. Nadia.
Thank you, Richard. Wonderful introduction there. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. And I want to send my solidarity to Jeremy again. The comprehensive spending review should have been the moment the government addressed the problems that real people are actually facing. Instead, this government chose to announce an unprecedented increase of £16 billion for defence spending. A department which is already allocated a massive annual budget of 41 billion, and it was all justified with right-wing soundbites about defending the realm. But who are we defending it from? 70% of children in this country live in poverty, and that's not due to some threat from beyond our shores. It's down to Tory policies over decades that have driven down living standards and employment rights. We've seen this dramatically increase during the pandemic, and it will continue to get worse if nothing is done. Thousands have lost their jobs, private renters faced eviction, and unscrupulous bosses have used fire and rehire tactics to drive down terms and conditions for workers. While government ministers were dragged kicking and screaming into providing free school meals to the poorest children in society, and while they announced a pay freeze for public sector workers, they'd already handed over 12 billion to Serco to set up a track and trace system that doesn't even work. So don't give me grandstanding and medieval rhetoric about defence of the realm. It's the corporations and this Tory government that the British people need protecting from. That 16 billion could have been used for so much more. We should be funding the lives of the millions of people impacted by the coronavirus. The economy is contracted by a fifth. Job losses and unemployment are projected in the millions, and we've endured 10 years of austerity under Tory misrule. We should invest in things that make a material difference to our lives during and after what has been the worst crisis we have faced as a country since the war. Not weapons and equipment to kill people. To get the economy moving, we must demand public ownership of key utilities and investment in public services, housing and education to create well-paid unionised jobs. People need help keeping a roof over their heads, a job and food on the table. We need to dismantle the rigged economy that puts profits and shareholders first and people and lives second. COVID-19 has highlighted the underfunding and under-resourcing of the NHS and social care. We need proper investment in healthcare. And if we really want to protect workers, we should increase the amount of statutory sick pay so that they can recover and isolate and not worry about whether they can pay their bills if they have to take time off work. If the Tories really want to keep people safe and secure, let's have a real living wage of at least £10 an hour. Let's build more council housing so people don't have to be at the mercy of landlords. And if we really want security in the future, we need a serious commitment to tackle the climate emergency. Those billions could have been allocated to help our fight for a proper Green New Deal, to invest in renewable energy, green infrastructure, and to provide a just transition, taking on the big polluters. That's how we protect people, not only in the UK, but across the globe. Because as far as I can see, people need protecting from the virus that's killing them. They need protecting from poverty pay, from the landlord that wants to evict them, from the bosses who fire and rehire them on worse paying conditions. They need protecting from the racism that's seen Black people and people from minority ethnic backgrounds disproportionately killed by this virus, and from the violence and hate directed at LGBT plus and disabled people, and from the discrimination faced by women in their homes and their workplaces. And if I want these protections for people here in the UK, I want them for people across the globe. Real patriotism and internationalism isn't £16 billion for bombs, ships and military boots on the ground. It means developing an ethical foreign policy that promotes negotiation, diplomacy and human rights for everyone, wherever they are on this planet. Because my solidarity doesn't end at the beachhead in Dover. It extends to all those across the world who fight against a rigged system, that fight for their right to a decent standard of living, and like you and I, fight for a better world. Solidarity.
Thanks so much, Nadia, and what a wonderful, insightful speech. I can hear people clapping. People are muted, but never mind, it's good to hear them clapping. And I'm sure there's lots of people clapping at home. And isn't it wonderful to hear a member of Labour's National Executive Committee, elected by the members, speaking with such passion, such knowledge and such conviction. Thank you so much. I now turn to our final speaker before we have a chance for questions, and that's a wonderful friend of mine, Emma Dent-Coad. And as you'll know, Emma is a Labour councillor in the London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and she's also Vice President of London Region CND. You'll also know that Emma was the Labour MP for Kensington between 2017 and 2019 and was the first Labour candidate ever to win an election to be the Member of Parliament for Kensington. And it was a real tragedy, I thought, when Emma narrowly lost in the 2019 general election. And I do hope those in the pages of The Guardian and elsewhere who recommended a vote for an ex-Tory MP minister who became a Lib Dem and stood in that seat, and thus ensured that they ended up with a Conservative MP instead. I hope they can reflect upon that political recommendation. Emma was a fantastic member of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs. Emma's always been a collectivist, which is so crucially important, and a highly principled socialist and anti-racist, and a decent, lovely person to boot as well. And she's best known, perhaps, across the country as a campaigner for justice for the victims of the Grenfell Tower disaster. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Emma Dent-Coad, Councillor Emma Dent-Coad, Vice President of London Region CND.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was and I'm so happy to follow the awesome Nadia, but thank you for that amazing build-up. I'm still here and I'm not going anywhere, believe me. I want to talk briefly to start with about nuclear banned communities and the worldwide treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So Carol, in her wisdom, has asked me to push the commitment to nuclear banned communities across London. And I haven't done very well so far because it's been a funny old year, but we're kind of working on it. So what we're doing here, because we certainly haven't got a government who's going to commit to this, is trying to get more and more communities, cities, groups of all kinds to sign up to nuclear banned communities, and hoping that by boosting this bit by bit, we'll get kind of snowball effect. I would love to think that when Sadiq Khan is re-elected in May, that we can start talking to him about this. And that's certainly my intention. We have a few peace mayors and so on, and we certainly are going to support this in Kensington CLP. I mean, we'll put the motion forward. If anybody is interested in how this can be done, it can be done with your CLPs. If you have a Labour constituency or a Labour council, try to get them to commit, and it's cnduk.org, nuclear banned communities. If you look it up, it tells you exactly what to do there. So I just wanted to put my pitch in there because I've been a bit behind with all of that. I'm just going to talk briefly about waste, nuclear waste. And to start with, looking at, there was a very good report from the Public Accounts Committee talking about nuclear energy sites and the utter disaster of the vast cost of actually cleaning them up and remediating and so on. It just does not happen. Well, so you know, the Public Accounts Committee, which was just last month, just a few weeks ago, said that nuclear sites are costing astronomical sums due to the ignorance, incompetence and weak oversight of the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. They don't know what kind of sites they've got where and so on, and they're trying to decommission, or they will be decommissioning 10 Magnox stations. And I find that really frightening that we don't even know what state they're in. How very frightening. It's going to cost an absolute fortune. It's going to cost 132 billion to decommission these and take probably 100 years. And basically, they're just going to bury it underground. So, you know, we've got very few operational nuclear power plants, Hinkley Point being built, if it ever is. And we're just going to bury this in the ground. This is a really great legacy for our children and grandchildren. So moving on now to weaponry. Trident, the insanity of spending all this money on Trident, on a weapon that we cannot use. We cannot use. It's literally a genocide weapon. How can we spend all that money on this when our economy is foundering, and we need skilled workers, and we need peacetime industries, and we need climate, environmental industries. But again, looking at the waste of these nuclear submarines, decommissioning nuclear submarines cost a fortune. We don't have the skills. We don't have the competence to do it. We don't have the sites to do it. And there are literally 9 nuclear submarines just sitting in the water down in Devonport, and I can't remember where. They still have irradiated fuel on board. None of them have had their fuel removed since 2004. The cost of disposing of these submarines is £96 million. What would it cost to decommission Trident if we ever get that off the ground? It's utter insanity to build these kind of weapons where we have no means of actually decommissioning them and getting rid of them. We're just burying them in the ground. We're not even recycling the steel because we can't get rid of this filthy, toxic waste that as I said, we are going to bury it in the ground and leave this for generations to come, along with the climate crisis, if we don't get to grips with it. So I'm finding all this quite alarming, and I really hope that bit by bit we have to nibble. This government is very keen on all the awful metaphorical rhetoric and so on about the jingoism. I find absolutely terrifying. And as we've already heard, we should be looking after our hungry neighbours, creating skilled jobs in the environment. Just think how much that money could how far that could go. Funding our public services, and obviously very specifically health. My poor ward in North Kensington, which I've represented since 2006, I stayed when I entered Parliament. Yet again this year is the poorest ward in London. And there's one little patch of it, which is the poorest bit of the poorest ward in London. And my God, it's so awful. Their health is going backwards. Their employment is going backwards. And how very, very shocking. I think Kensington's a microcosm of everything that's got wrong in the country. And we have people who are seriously impoverished, and our food banks are the only thing which are flourishing here. And I find that terrifying. It makes absolutely no sense to waste money on this. We could actually eradicate poverty if we had the will. Or how much better we would be off than just creating weapons that we can't use, genocide weapons. So that's I love this term of pause, the lidism. I think that's excellent. So yeah, I'm very much for the diversification, and more than anything post-Grenfell. I would really want to train a whole new generation of construction workers to build a new generation of warm and fire-safe homes. And that's what so many people, hundreds of thousands of people across the country are thinking. Can we ever do this? Can we actually build new homes that are warm and fire-safe? Where's the technology for that? Let's invest in that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was fantastic. Really great to hear from you. And now people will be pleased to know we're moving to questions. So keep your questions coming in so that we can pick from them. Now I'm going to scroll down now and find a question to ask. Okay, there's a first question. And this is from Rona, who asks each panelist, why are so few people talking about defence jobs diversifying into jobs involving green sustainability? Paul, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's one of the things we tend to forget. If we do change away from high military spending, that does mean loss of jobs in a number of industries. It's absolutely crucial that we're ahead of the game on this and working out how you can best diversify things. There's huge scope for that. And on occasions in the past, some people may remember, older ones like me, there was actually the Lucas Aerospace shop stewards did a lot of work on this back in the 1980s, and C&A's published stuff on this. But certainly, if you're going to talk about really moving away from the current military-industrial complex, you've got to recognize the many, many people who work in it at present. So diversification, planning in advance is crucially important. And the big companies have to be, well, it has to be demanded of them that they plan to do this. It's their responsibility. So yes, it's a key one. It's a very good point to raise at the start.
Jeremy, would you like to?
Very briefly, very good question. I agree with what Paul just said. It is important to ensure we do think this thing through very seriously and do not threaten jobs in any of the shipbuilding or engineering or aircraft industries that are immediately affected, but instead we start investing in other things. And I made that very clear during both general election campaigns that we would protect those jobs in order for those skills to be retained for making other things. I remember in 1991 having a meeting with British Aerospace, who were concerned about the future work at Brooklands and other places because of the then cutback in defence orders because of the end of the Cold War. And so I said to the company, could you be making something else? And they said, we'd love to. Give us the nod and give us the investment. We would be happy to do far more for civilian aircraft or indeed for civilian shipping. And I think it's that sort of area we need to look at as rapidly as possible. The Scottish government has developed a great deal of work on defence diversification, and I think we should be doing the same, because the Ebola crisis showed just how good trained people in the military can be in dealing with what was a health epidemic in that place, just as much as when they've been asked to do it, the Navy have done extremely well in saving lives in the Mediterranean of desperate people trying to get to Lampedusa. And so let's not condemn the skills that are there, welcome and support those skills that were there, and start looking at ways we can bring about a safer and more secure world with those skills.
Thanks, Jeremy. Emma, do you want to offer some reflections on that question about diversification to green jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned it very briefly in passing, but absolutely. And I do think particularly a whole new generation of I mean, after Brexit, God help us, we won't be able to get materials over here to build, let alone have the skilled workers. And there are highly skilled workers in the defence industry, and please, can we retrain them to do other things that are more purposeful with some social value? 100%. And I don't even know what kind of research is going into creating warm homes that don't have 6 inches thick of insulation on them, even if it is fire safe. That whole industry needs an awful lot of work put into it. It seems, it's run by, if anyone's been watching the Grenfell inquiry, awful, run by utterly corrupt and people with no knowledge. I'm being as polite as I can, but we need people with really good skills in that whole industry, and that is one of many things where we need highly motivated and educated and skilled people.
Thanks, Emma. The next question I've got here is a really good question from Ruth, and I think I'll come to Jeremy on this first, if possible. Ruth asks, what are the best arguments to use against the policy of nuclear weapons and against the policy of this record increase in military spending, given the inevitable attacks by the Tory press? So since attacks by the Tory press are one of Jeremy's specialist subjects, I thought I'd go to him first.
I've no idea where you get that idea from, Richard. I hope it doesn't demonstrate your view taken to reading the Daily Mail. Yes, the arguments to use are quite simply these, in my view. What is real security. What is fear? Fear is of a random disease like the coronavirus 19. It is the fear of an irrational attack on people, a terrorist attack. It is the fear of the way in which we're breathing foul air and watching our environment being destroyed. Does our current policy of spending the amount of money we do on nuclear weapons meet any of those demands or any of those issues? And obviously the answer is it doesn't in any way. So I think you have to ask people to reflect on what is real security in this world. But it also means challenging a lot of the very right-wing notions surrounding refugees and the way in which they're abused and ill-treated. Because if you read some of the right-wing papers, they will tell you that 500 people seeking asylum in Britain amounts to an invasion of refugees from all over Europe. I have to tell them that Bangladesh has already received 1 million refugees from Myanmar, and with hardly any comment at all in the global media, yet a relatively small number of very desperate people risking their lives in the English Channel or the Mediterranean warrants blanket headlines. So it is a question about challenging a lot of other agendas in the media. But my argument would simply be this: Corona, environment, economic security, jobs, education, health, and housing. How do we deal with those issues? The vast majority of the world's countries don't have nuclear weapons. A huge proportion of the world's population live in nuclear weapons-free zones. And as Paul gave you the exact figures, the vast majority of states represented in the UN General Assembly, and that is every state is represented in the UN General Assembly, voted to end all nuclear weapons.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. And Emma, who also knows a thing or two about attacks from the Tory press locally and nationally. Do you want to share your reflections on how we defend our position against these inevitable attacks on those that oppose this policy in the right-wing press?
Avoid the sheer nastiness and fight back with facts. That's the only way it probably won't stop them, but just don't get into the nastiness and the ping pong on Twitter and email and so on, and just state the facts and then walk away. I think really you have to be well armed with facts, because all they come up with are slurs.
That's really useful. That's a really good point to make, because our argument is a moral argument, but it's also an argument based upon fact and an objective perspective as well on the real dangers and real challenges facing humanity in this country and around the world. Can I ask Professor Rogers to share his views on this issue?
I suppose just one thing to add: if you take a single Trident nuclear missile submarine, depending on how you load it and target the missiles, you could kill 20 million people in the space of a few hours. That's the reality. And is that how we become a great power? Is that what civilization is about? I think you had to meet it head on and say, this is absolutely atrocious. There's no way this can be justified by any country. And this is why I think the UN Convention, which is due to come into force, in about 5 weeks' time, is so important. We do not need this. There are far better things to do if we want to pretend to be a civilized country.
Thanks very much, Professor Rogers. A question's come in from Julia, which I'll address. Julia is asking about networking between constituency Labour parties and with Labour-run local authorities about being nuclear ban communities. And so my answer to that really is to keep Labour CND informed. And Labour CND are very happy to put local activists in touch with each other. So I think the organising unit for that, really, the best organising unit for that is Labour CND, which has members all over the country and can put members in touch with each other and help to advise upon lobbying Labour-run local authorities and getting motions passed at constituency Labour parties. I see Emma's got a hand up. She wants to add something.
Yeah, I just want to put a good word in for Yorkshire CND. They are absolutely brilliant. They're super organised. They've got actually a part-time worker working on it. They are my kind of model for perfection for 2021. Big up Yorkshire, and they've got their website so people can look at it and copy it. I'm sure they'll be honoured.
Well said, Emma, well said. In terms of other questions I've got coming through, let me have a look. This is a question specifically for Paul, and this question is, what security threats does the government identify in their analysis, and does this spending hike of £16 billion protect us from those identified security risks?
They have a number of risks. They regard the risk of state on state conflict, as relatively low at present. They are concerned about cybersecurity. One of the big security risks is actually pandemics, and that is a tier 1 risk. And the extraordinary thing we've seen recently is Britain does actually have a very good biosecurity strategy. It was published 2 years ago, and it claimed that it showed that Britain was world leading. In fact, Britain and the United States were the 2 countries which were rated the best for this by the World Economic Forum, and they turned out to be among the worst. And the problem is that we did not follow through on what could have been a good strategy. There's not time to go into COVID, but believe me, right from the start, this government got it dramatically wrong, and thousands of people died as a result of that. But no, there are a range of things which they say. I say the most relevant one now is actually the risk of pandemics, and that was clearly down there, but just not followed. They're not really looking seriously at climate breakdown. They do look at terrorism, certainly, but essentially, as I say, state-on-state action, for which Trident is meant to be there, is not one of the most dangerous ones as far as they're concerned.
Well, that's a sobering and revealing analysis indeed. People will see who want to take action as a result of this meeting. They'll see in the chat a link to Labour CND's online lobbying tool to speak out in opposition to the Tory military spending spree. So if people haven't used it already, please do so. The link has just been posted on the chat a few seconds ago. And I'm just seeing if there are any other questions before we wind up. Yep, I've got a question from Chris. And Chris asks, does Labour still have a shadow peace and disarmament minister? The answer is yes. And I, in fact, bumped into him. He was on his bike the other week when I was on a walk in Leeds, and he cycled past, and we had a chat in the street about this and other issues. That's Fabian Hamilton. He's the Labour MP for Leeds North East. But the important point to mention about this as well is that Labour CND actually campaigned to retain this post of Shadow Peace and Disarmament Minister. It was a post that was actually created during Jeremy's leadership, and there were rumours afoot and reports afoot that the post may have disappeared or was about to disappear. But Labour CND ran a very vocal lobbying campaign about this, and we're pleased to see that the new Labour leadership, Keir and his team, retained that post following that campaign. And so now we need to ensure that they also retain the policies. And on that note, Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Richard. Just very briefly, and thanks, Chris, for that question. I was very keen to have a peace and disarmament shadow minister, and we did. I appointed Fabian to undertake that work for us, and I deliberately appointed as a shadow minister, but placed in several teams. He was attached both the defence team, the DFID team, and to the foreign affairs team, and his job was to liaise between them and also to represent us at NPT and other forums, which he did and still does. There was some pressure on to set up a Ministry of Peace, and I thought about this a great deal, and I was quite concerned that we could indeed, of course, have set up a Ministry of Peace, but the danger with that would be it would be a sort of feel-good ministry separate from the other departments which are dealing with international relations and international affairs. And I thought it would be rather better if we had somebody arguing, obviously within ministerial teams, but also arguing in the culture of those other ministries about the peaceful role that we could play on international development, on foreign policy in general, particularly around the UN disarmament strategy, and of course in the Ministry of Defence. And I'm really pleased, and thanks Labour CND for arguing so strongly to retain that position. And I think it's very important that we do that, because it means there has to be somebody there who is committed to peace and disarmament. And the original ministers for disarmament went back to Wilson era in the 1960s, when he appointed Lord Chalfont, as he then was, still as he was, and his job was to argue for peace. And from that, whilst I didn't agree with the Polaris policy of the government, we did at least get a government that supported the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been one of the most important nuclear weapons treaties there's been and still is. And I hope to be going to the NPT review conference when it resumes next year.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. We've got plenty of questions coming in, but we had said that this meeting was going to end at 5 in a few moments. So what I'd suggest, it's been such a good meeting and such a good discussion, it'd be good if we can have another debate, another discussion at a future occasion organised by Labour CND and Arise, which is more solely devoted or more majority devoted to questions and contributions from participants. So let's try and organise that going forward. Just to finish off, I do want to thank everyone for joining us. This campaign is more urgent than ever. Just as we believe in socialism, we also believe in peace, and the threat to world peace and security of all the citizens of the globe has never been under greater threat. So I really want to thank everybody who's taken part in this meeting, all the panellists, Labour CND, Carol Turner, Arise as well. And if each of the remaining panellists, Emma, Paul and then Jeremy, if you want to just spend 30 seconds each with some final remarks, that would be wonderful. Emma?
Yes, thank you so much. And first of all, I want to say how lovely it is to see you, Richard and Jeremy. Miss you guys. And I'm not going anywhere, as I said. Yeah, I think more than anything else, as I've said, we have to arm ourselves with the facts. And hello, my cat has come to say hello. Hello.
What's your cat's name?
Dobby, because she's
Dobby.
Beautiful. Naked.
What a coat as well.
She's got no hair. Yeah, more than anything else, as I said, I think we have to arm ourselves with facts and look at and just say, well, what are our priorities? Do we really want to arm a whole new generation of genocide submarines? Or do we actually want to feed people? And I think we have to put it really clearly and just have the facts at our fingertips always, because there are people hungry out there and the money's going in the wrong direction. Let's be very, very clear about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Professor Rogers?
I think just speak with confidence about what we could do. There's lots of stuff out there about what kind of security policy we could have to be far more effective in the world. And just basically speak on the assumption when you're talking to people that the current system is nuts. And basically now is the time to start changing it. Be confident about what we're saying.
There's a fantastic tip. That's completely correct. Thanks very much. And Jeremy?
Thanks, Richard, and thank you all for coming to this webinar. And I absolutely endorse what Richard said about having another one with more time for questions and discussion, which I think would be very welcome. And I'd be happy to support it, even just to listen. I agree absolutely the way Paul put it. Speak with confidence. Speak with confidence. Be accurate, as Emma has said, and with sincerity about the real issues facing this world. On food insecurity, on human rights abuses, on climate change, on pandemic threats, and the threats of war in Yemen, well, it's continuing in Yemen, and of course the dangers of a breakdown of relations with Iran within the region and a further conflict from that, and argue the case for a non-nuclear defense policy and indeed a policy around the world which is about investment in people in order to end the inequalities and injustice in the world. And I think there is a huge number of people that can be mobilized around that, and our party must never turn its back on that whole agenda of peace, justice, democracy and human rights.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Professor Paul Rogers. Thanks to Nadia, who's had to leave. Thanks to Arise and Labour CND. And thanks to everyone for joining.